The Protestant Reformation produced multiple visions of what Christian life, worship, and community should look like, and few figures illustrate these differences more clearly than Martin Luther and John Calvin. Although both reformers sought to challenge the authority and practices of the Catholic Church, they developed distinct theological perspectives that shaped not only religious belief, but also daily conduct, church organization, and public life. Luther emphasized faith, patience, and trust in God's mercy within the existing social order, while Calvin advanced a more disciplined and structured approach that called for active moral effort and the transformation of society according to biblical principles. These contrasting outlooks can be seen across several key areas, including attitudes toward the Christian life, observance of the Sabbath, church government, forms of worship, and the role of religion in civic life, revealing how their ideas helped produce different expressions of Protestantism that would influence Europe and beyond. Luther emphasized a posture of passive endurance, teaching that the Christian's primary duty was to endure life's trials with faith in God's mercy. His approach highlighted trust in God, patience in suffering, humility, and acceptance of one's social role within the existing order. Calvin, by contrast, promoted a far more active and disciplined form of Christian living. He urged believers to labor constantly for the glory of God, to guide others toward a correct understanding of Scripture, and to shape their lives through rigorous moral effort. As a result, Calvin's theology often appeared more legalistic and more deeply rooted in Old Testament models of discipline and obedience than Luther's. The differences between Luther and Calvin can be clearly seen in their views on the Sabbath. Luther held a view of Sunday that is familiar to many modern Christians. It was a day to attend church, avoid unnecessary labor, and rest. Calvin, however, adopted a much stricter position, attempting to revive a form of the Jewish Sabbath by forbidding activities that resembled worldly entertainment, thereby emphasizing discipline and moral seriousness even in leisure time. The differences between Luther and Calvin were also evident in their approaches to church government. Luther broke with the Catholic hierarchical system but did not abandon hierarchy altogether, believing that some structure was necessary to maintain order. In place of bishops, he introduced superintendents who performed similar oversight functions for the clergy. Calvin, by contrast, sought to eliminate ecclesiastical hierarchy entirely. He argued that each congregation should have the authority to elect its own ministers, placing power not in a vertical structure but in collective bodies. Church authority, in his model, rested in assemblies of ministers and lay elders working together to preserve doctrinal purity and enforce moral discipline within the community. The differences between Luther and Calvin were also reflected in their approaches to worship. Luther retained many elements of traditional Catholic worship, including altars, clerical vestments, music and hymns, and visual art, believing that these features supported devotion and helped guide believers in their faith. Calvin, however, rejected anything he associated with what he termed popery, meaning practices connected to the Pope or Catholic ritual. As a result, he abolished vestments, elaborate rituals, music and organs, statues, stained glass, and decorative altars. In their place, Calvin established a much simpler form of worship that focused almost entirely on the reading and preaching of Scripture. This stark simplicity led some critics to joke that Calvin's churches were little more than 4 bare walls and a sermon. Calvin went beyond developing theology and provided a practical blueprint for organizing Protestant churches and communities through his work known as the Ecclesiastical Ordinances. This guide made it possible to establish a Calvinist church anywhere, offering a clear structure for both spiritual and social life. At the heart of this system were 4 permanent church offices. Pastors were responsible for preaching the word, administering the sacraments, overseeing spiritual matters, and meeting regularly to address theological issues. Teachers focused on educating both children and adults, instructing them in Christian doctrine and promoting high moral standards. Elders were tasked with supervising public morality, enforcing discipline, and investigating misconduct among the faithful, while deacons cared for the poor, widows, orphans, and others in need through organized charity. In Calvin's vision, there was no separation between church and state. Instead, the entire community was to be thoroughly Christian, with moral discipline maintained through the combined efforts of religious and civic authorities. In 1541, John Calvin began a sweeping effort to reform the city of Geneva, according to the principles laid out in his Institutes of the Christian Religion and his ecclesiastical ordinances, transforming the city into a model Protestant community. At the center of this system stood the consistory, the most important governing body, composed of pastors, including Calvin himself, and 12 lay elders, many of whom also held positions in the city's civil government. Meeting weekly, the consistory functioned as a moral court, enforcing discipline based on biblical principles such as those found in Matthew 18. Because the same individuals often served both religious and civic roles, the boundaries between church and state were deeply intertwined. The moral discipline enforced in Geneva was strict and sometimes severe. Within a span of 4 years, 58 people were executed and 76 were exiled for various offenses. One individual was reportedly jailed simply for naming a dog Calvin. Punishable actions ranged from religious deviations, such as owning biographies of saints, assisting Catholic ritual practices, or expressing approval of the Pope, to behaviors deemed morally improper, including drunkenness, indecent dancing, card playing, or wearing revealing clothing. Even folk healing methods, like attempting to cure illness with a walnut shell and a spider, were condemned as superstition. Despite these efforts, Geneva was not free from social problems. Prostitution remained widespread, and the consistory struggled to eliminate it. At one point, repeat offenders were publicly shamed by being forced to march through the streets wearing red hats while accompanied by a trumpeter announcing their offenses. Other reforms proved unpopular, such as the closure of taverns and their replacement with Bible-filled coffeehouses, an experiment so disliked that the taverns were eventually reopened. These challenges reveal that while Calvin was highly influential, he was not all-powerful. Political opposition periodically threatened his authority, and his opponents at times came close to gaining control of the city council and abolishing the consistory, though they ultimately failed. Calvin remained the dominant figure in Geneva until his death in 1564. Despite his strict reputation, Calvin was not opposed to enjoyment or the pleasures of everyday life. In his Institutes, he made it clear that activities such as laughter, enjoying good food, acquiring possessions, appreciating music, and even drinking wine were not forbidden to Christians. What concerned Calvin was not pleasure itself, but the danger of excess and the breakdown of moral discipline. For him, enjoyment was acceptable as long as it remained within proper bounds and did not lead believers away from a life ordered toward God. Calvin provided Protestants with both a complete theological system and a detailed, practical manual for organizing church life. His ideas offered not only a clear statement of belief, but also a workable model for building disciplined Christian communities. Using Calvin's framework, Reformed and Presbyterian churches spread across Europe and eventually throughout the wider world. While Luther ignited the Reformation with his initial challenge to the Catholic Church, it was Calvin who gave the movement its most durable structure and lasting institutional form.